Welcome to this week's episode of the Prep Athletics Podcast. I am proud to have 30 for 30 director John Dorsey on the podcast. Now, John works in the same industry as my wife, Josie, documentaries, and he actually lives in Evergreen, our hometown, and wanted to get him on because he did two of the best 30 for 30s. Pony Excess, which is about the SMU football scandal in the early 80s, and then the Marinovich Project about Todd Marinovich and how his dad was pretty maniacal in training him to become the best quarterback in the country, and then it led ultimately to drug use and getting kicked out of the NFL, and a really good one there. We go into his background, and I found out he worked on the Johnny Cash Hurt video, which was one of the best music videos of all time. He gives us insight on that, and we talk about the difference between being a producer, a director, and more about the film industry and how to get into it and what his background was. Near the end, we have a woodpecker join us, knocking on that wall behind me, and causing a little bit of a ruckus, so you'll enjoy that. And also, we're going to put this at the beginning, but it's an ask. If you guys like this, be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel, and be sure to go to prepathletics.com to sign up for our newsletter, where every month you'll get the latest updates in the prep school world, signings, information, videos, podcasts, et cetera, et cetera. So thank you so much for tuning in today, and enjoy this interview with director John Dorsey. Welcome to the Prep Athletics Podcast. This is Corey Heights.
Some battles. I'm not sure if they got us. If they did, maybe.
So you will get better as a player during that year.
So it was kind of exciting. Like, oh yeah, somebody wants me.
John, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Corey. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, now you are in filmmaking and whatnot, but let's go back to the beginning. Where did you get your interest in film and producing and stuff that shows up on TV and the movie screens?
Well, I mean, I think I shared the same origin story as most people, which is that, like everyone, I was, moved by things that I thought were cool that I had seen, but never thought that there was a road to actually doing it, and just thought it was the domain of people who had access to pathways that I didn't have. And midway through college, I was accumulating a bunch of electives, really, that just were telling me something. I thought I was going to go to law school, and I was like a history major and whatever. And so I took out a second major. I just realized, hey, I'm like 3/4 of the way there already. And I took out a fifth year of school. Rather than go to graduate school, I took a fifth year out of school at the undergrad level that ended up being almost like a conservatory-like experience, because I didn't have any other classes that final year other than film classes. So it was like a compressed graduate school in that respect, and that it was highly concentrated. And it was a preview of the rest of my life, which was that it wasn't like work. You know what I mean? I mean, I just kind of didn't dread getting up in the morning to go to class. And, just like now, I don't really dread getting up in the morning and going to work. So, yeah.
Is film school, are you watching movies and discussing them? Are you going out in the field, making your own shorts? Walk me through what that's like.
In my case, it was a lot of theory. In my case, theory sounds like you're breaking something apart, like in a mathematical way. It was a lot of discussion about techniques and motifs and things that are playing at a subconscious level that you think are happening, but you need someone else to ratify that that's really what's happening and that there's intentionality behind it, right? And then you're like, yeah, okay. And then you feel like you have a grasp of a mindset for, it just doesn't seem as mysterious. And so there was a lot of that, a lot of watching movies that I wouldn't normally have been exposed to and discussing them and seeing them in their proper context as they related to the times in which they were made, not just in the United States, but elsewhere. And in a way, it was like traveling without moving. I mean, you're watching all of these different cultures on display with the mirror of the filmmaking process held up to them and the time and place in which they were created. And it's kind of, it's exciting. And now, I do the same thing. I kind of open up windows to worlds that might be far away for other people to kind of dip their toe into. So,
yeah, did the theory help you with your filmmaking, or is it more getting out and practicing it and doing on your own, or did they both work in conjunction with each other?
Well, it makes you more confident to kind of know that you have a vocabulary, but some of that vocabulary comes from experience in terms of, knowing how to apply certain things to a given set of circumstances. And some of that confidence comes from having, or some of that vocabulary rather comes from, and the confidence that comes from that vocabulary comes from just being fluent and knowing that you're fluent in kind of like what's been done before. And then, the old kind of cliche of like every artist is a cannibal and every poet is a thief type of thing. You're early on, you're referencing and maybe doing, what's charitably considered an homage. And then over time, those things that you reference in your own work become more kind of, there's a synthesis more with, you're not so much ripping something off so much as kind of, executing something that's been inspired by or that you've absorbed fully into your own kind of vocabulary. So, and I also had some mentors early on that I got to sit and watch. So some of it was like what I watched in the classroom. My classroom also was kind of watching these mentors do what they did, like up close and personal for years. And so I worked with Barry Levinson, who, in the sports context, people might know did The Natural, but he also did like Rain Man and Good Morning Vietnam and Diner. And I worked on Wag the Dog. People remember that movie.
Oh, yeah.
And so watching someone who was considered kind of a master of their craft make decisions on the fly, what to make a big deal out of and what not to make a big deal out of was informative. And then I had another experience where I worked at this company called Propaganda Films, which was, I think there's a documentary about that place. It was really kind of a salon of the late 90s, the 90s zeitgeist of music video making, where in the same building, this one little building, it was David Fincher, Michel Gondry, Simon West, Spike Jonze, Mark Romanek. I mean, you go down the list, it was just a really heady environment where ideas were just being, every day there was a new production. Every day someone was kind of one-upping the director next door. And it was a really healthy environment to watch kind of a competitive exchange of ideas going on. And so I think all those things really are experiences that I subconsciously, not even on a conscious level, kind of apply every day and just make me feel more confident,
You got your reps in. So just like an athlete would have.
Yeah. Exactly.
I would watch that propaganda documentary because those guys, there's some big time names there who most of them went on to make big time films too after those.
Absolutely. Yeah. They're like, it's like, it was all under one roof. Yes. That's right.
What's your favorite music video of all time? Any stand out?
Sure. Well, I worked on the Johnny Cash Hurt video.
Your kid, that gives goosebumps watching that.
Yeah. So that's probably up there. I have a lot of music documentaries that really kind of like, to me are the gold standard for like how music is conveyed in a visual format, and have been touchdowns for me. But I'd say in the music video for sure, Hurt's up there.
Well, Hurt, that's song one. I'm a huge Trent Reznor fan, one. So two is cool to hear Johnny sing it. But what took that song to the next level, obviously, was the video. And actually, my wife and I think maybe 2 months ago, pulled it up on YouTube just to see it again. At the end, we both just had goosebumps, which is amazing when a music video, right, which some of those are just throwaways for some people, can do that. So you worked on a historical video there, John.
Well, in the process, this isn't about me, but except that I had just in terms of having a window into, a master's process. That was Mark Romanek, who was directing that, who did a ton of great music videos. He did Are You Gonna Go My Way by Lenny Kravitz. He did Nine Inch Nails Closer. He did Nine Inch Nails Perfect Drug. He did Rain by Madonna. He did Michael and Janet Jackson Scream. I could go down he did Beck's Devil's Haircut. Just go down the list. But in that case, it was a really instructive moment because we went down to the House of Cash, which was the museum that was supposed to be the, repository of Johnny Cash's archive. And we were going in there thinking, what's Johnny Cash? It's a legend. It's going to be this really slick, well-maintained place that's a lot of TLC is, on display, taking care of the place. And instead it was in decay. And rather than be disappointed by that, we used it as a serendipitous opportunity that was completely in lockstep with the theme of the music, which was this kind of empire in decay, right? What have I become? My empire of dirt, right? And so now it was an eerie parallel that was not planned, but taken advantage of.
Yeah, love that. let's fast forward to your 30 for 30s. And you did one of my favorite, the Marinovich Project. Walk us through this. Like, I get this living in a household with a filmmaker, but for those out there listening to this that don't know how it works, you get the task of telling Todd Marinovich's story. All right. How do you, as a director / producer, figure out like archive footage, who we're going to interview, where we're going to interview them? Where do you start with?
Well, with Todd, the big thing was kind of coaxing him out of the shadows. I mean, like he was this J.D. Salinger like figure that had entered in the mythology, and no one knew where he was. And when we found him, everyone knew he had a drug problem, but he had. By the time that we found him, he was freshly sober, but his sobriety was pretty fragile. Given recently he had made the turn, and he was basically cleaning barnacles off the bottom of boats in South Bay in California, and had rightly built up a lot of scar tissue in relation to his dealings with the media, because he was, no sooner had they built him up to be this mythological figure than they were, all too happy to tear him down. And he felt like he was just all the while an unwilling piece of cannon fodder for the media from really the cradle to the end of his career. And so getting him to revisit all of that was kind of a parlor trick. And then once we got him in the boat, so to speak, we wanted to put him in an environment that he, like any subject, where he was comfortable. And for those who haven't seen the film, we did the hero interviews with him out on the beach. It was kind of a memorable visual component of the film, directly addressing the camera in an environment that somehow just subconsciously made sense for him visually, but also made him comfortable. And so it's kind of a win-win, really. I mean, it was on message for this kid who kind of grew up. It was the ultimate Southern California story as it relates to football, at least. And yet also made him feel at ease.
But John, like, do you know out there, like, we've got to get Todd to make this project, or would you have made it without him, just using archival footage? Like, you wouldn't have made it.
There was no way we were going to do it without him. The get was getting him. I mean, the opener for ESPN was, wait, you found him? And yeah, and he's in. And so that was the asset that we came to the table with, was that we were delivering Marinovich from obscurity,
All right. And then you dealt with his dad too, who's one of a kind in the high school sports world. Yeah. We talk about crazy dads all the time. He's kind of the OG crazy dad.
Yeah.
What did you, tell me about that. Like, what was it like being with that guy? No, like, cause he seemed menacing on camera almost. Did you feel that?
I mean, I can say this now, when we did our interview with him, I mean, it was a measure of just how rough it must have been for Todd to see any glimmer of tenderness, but because to get him to admit that he loved his son took like 90 minutes. I mean, it was like pulling teeth. It's not that he didn't love him. Obviously, he spent more time with his son than most parents by a large measure. And like, it wasn't just that his son was a project. It was also, of course, that he loved him. But expressing that was not something that came naturally to him. And he definitely had walls up that needed to be penetrated. And it took a while to get there. So I can, and this is, according to Todd, a much softer version with old age than the one that he dealt with. So yeah, Marv is definitely, Todd's story in general is kind of the canary in the coal mine for what's transpired with youth athletics over the course of a couple generations now, where the rush to kind of accelerate development and the money spent, what was once exotic is now commonplace, and in the 80s, Todd's story was a curiosity. Now there's a whole cottage industry that is designed to kind of do a lot of the same things that Marv was doing, that was being scoffed at the time. But I think, Marv's the fact that it was his own son kind of crossed some lines that I think were ill-advised.
Absolutely. And I'm going to go back to your alma mater of SMU, and you also did the 30 for 30 Pony Excess on, the great run that SMU football had in the early 80s, and kind of what you mentioned about Marv, where, parents now pay thousands of dollars to get that kind of training. Now everything SMU got the death penalty for is legal. So how do you feel as an alum and someone that covered this and lived it? How does that make you feel now? Same with Reggie Bush. Like Reggie, I think he's suing the NCAA now for all the hardship they put them through. So this shift that's happened the past 40 years, what are your thoughts on all this?
Well, it's funny. There's a lot of ink being spilt in Dallas about these boosters who now are like, the gloves are off. And so all the things that were once forbidden are now, kind of standard operating procedure. Yeah, man. I mean, I grew up in Dallas, and I had a ringside seat for everything growing up there, watching the scandal unfold in high school. And then I became a freshman the first year back from the death penalty, and they had no scholarships, all walk-ons. They had Forrest Gregg, who was the coach, but they still, kind of out of hubris or whatever, they still had a schedule that included, now, again, with everyone, every good player had transferred out, and no scholarships coming in, all walk-ons, and they were playing like Lou Holtz's Notre Dame and David Klingler and the run and shoot at the University of Houston. I think they lost 95-21. And I think our college paper did the math and deduced that if we would have just kneeled the ball 3 and out, it would have been mathematically impossible for them to have scored 95 points, but we had to actually actively turn the ball over.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. So with back to Marinovich and back to Pony XS, when you get these subjects, right? You as a director, and are you interviewing as well on these, John? Are you the one interviewing Todd? Okay, so you got to have a certain skill set to get a guy like Todd Marinovich to want to do this, and then you've got to ask the right questions. You got to ask him in the right tone. Is that something you learn in film school? Do you learn that just through rep?
I don't know. That part, I don't think it's like a rarefied skill, but at the same time, I don't think it's something that you can teach. I spend probably 3 hours of preparation for every 1 hour of interview. And that preparation is not about where the camera goes. It's about like anticipating every deflection, every redirect that can be put forward to kind of penetrate someone's defenses and get to the spirit of the truth. And so with Todd, a good example. I mean, so you kind of have to have a key kind of, what do they call it? Like EQ, like emotional IQ, right? And I'm not sure that that's necessarily something you can teach. I think that I wouldn't know what to say to someone other than prepare for every possible response, then try and get back to where you suspect the truth lies through a line of questioning that's a little bit like, I don't know if you ever heard the phrase, like in life, I think Mike Nichols said, like in life, everything is either a negotiation or a seduction. And I think that like interviews are a seduction, and you kind of got to lead them into a place where they feel comfortable and find the right kind of keys in language that kind of that are a framework that allows you to kind of go make it feel like it's their idea to go in a place that they might not have otherwise wanted to go. In Todd's case, you have a limited amount of money on any production, and so you have a limited amount of shoot days for your interviews, and you have one of two choices. You can either go right at the heart of the matter of the most difficult subjects on day one and know that you've got multiple bites at the apple because you've got, let's say, 4 or 5 interview days, shoot days to try and get there, but you run the risk of alienating the subject by you starting right off the bat with the heaviest material, or you can build trust and then run the risk that you only have 1 day left to get the goods. And so on the day of the final interview with Todd, where a lot of the best stuff came from, we had a relationship at that point. And he's a very giving, cool dude. And so off camera, we were kind of like in a bro space, really. But on camera, of course, it's a different thing. But kind of like capitalizing on that relationship that we had built, the day of the final interview that we're going to do out on the beach, I was texting him from the production van on my way down to, I think it was like Costa Mesa or something like that. Anyway, I was texting him and I sent this long diatribe that basically essentially said, if you're emotionally generous with the audience, they will reciprocate and it will come back to you in waves. And in his case, that very much was the case. And the film did end up becoming kind of catalyst for positive change in his life and how he was perceived. And in large measure, that was because of where he was willing to go and with the authenticity that he was kind of like willing to display.
And what's he doing nowadays? Do you know?
He's living in Southern California. He's painting. So I don't know if you remember in the film, but like he had he was raised to be a quarterback, but that's not necessarily what he wanted to do. He wanted to be a fine artist, and even in college, he had studied fine art and painting while he was the QB of the Rose Bowl winning USC Trojans, and just was on a path that seemed kind of foretold for him, and he had no choice about what to do. But when the film was made, again, serendipity, he was about newly sober, getting his life back, finding the direction that he always thought was the one that he really wanted to pursue, had coinciding with our production, just his first ever art showing downtown LA. So we decided to make that whole thing a centerpiece, a framing mechanism for the film. And because of the exposure that the film gave him, and at the time, 30 for 30 was very much at its height of popularity, he got more commissions than he can ever get to in his lifetime. And now, was able to kind of pursue what he felt was his true call.
That's awesome. That's awesome. That's a great story. From there, you actually, one of your later projects was Glory Hounds, which you produced military dogs in Afghanistan. Tell me how you pivoted to that and what interested you in that story, Joe.
Well, I love dogs. And I was on a plane and I saw this ad that was kind of for some nonprofit that was about finding homes for service animals who had retired and everything. And the war was raging at that time and in Afghanistan. And I just kind of like made this cognitive leap from like that thing to imagining the bond that must happen. And like sometimes your imagination outpaces reality, but I started painting this picture in my mind of this movie about like, how soldiers in war zone have no outlet whatsoever. They have to front like they're hard all the time. Like even this is a survival mechanism, and they have no outlet for tenderness, but these guys do because they have this animal, and it's, they can like privately have these tender asides with this thing that must be a very healthy outlet. That's a privilege for them that other soldiers or Marines wouldn't have. So I thought, okay, well, that could be a cool movie. That's really just the story of a boy and his dog magnified by the insanity of getting shot and the intensity of the relationship getting ratcheted up because of that. And so yeah, then I started like, that was a very heavy lift, getting permission to go shoot in a war zone and get the money to do it, getting insured to do it. And it was a little bit of a house of cards getting, on the one hand, the military would want to know that you had a distribution in place because they didn't want to just waste their time entertaining just any Joe with a good idea. They wanted to know that you could execute on the idea. And so they wanted to know you had a distributor. On the other hand, a distributor wanted to know that you had the commitment of the military. And so threading that needle was a little bit of a trick, but it all worked out. And it was definitely the most rewarding thing I've ever done.
John, it's dangerous over there filming that. I mean, you get a lot of action footage.
I mean, it's hard to communicate the first impression. You think, well, it's a desert, because this part of the part of Afghanistan, you're in the two deadliest provinces in Afghanistan, and in particular, this area called the Horn of Panjwai, which is literally the birthplace of the Taliban. And a lot of it looks arid, and you just think it's going to be hot and like a desert, like, Arizona. The second you got off the plane, you're just like hit with this wave of humidity. So it's like this, when you're hot, you kind of, it's hard to keep your focus. And then you think about these guys and they're carrying like 30 pounds or 40 pounds of gear, humping it in 110 degrees with, 70% humidity. And they're supposed to maintain their focus and watch every step because there could be IEDs. You're just like, oh my God, like the biggest enemy in some respects was the climate. But for sure, it was scary. And the truth of the matter is I was there for, a little bit, but I definitely stood on the shoulders of the crew that I put together, very deliberately composed of people who had either a prior career in the military and had now a second career as production people, or just were like people who had made a career of being in hotspots or around the world as photojournalists type of people who you knew would not lose their sea legs when stuff went down. And to their credit, they maintained their focus and their composure and came home with terrific materials.
And do those dogs, when they're retired, they do go to just normal civilian families, or do they stay with military folks, do you think?
Well, so in the film, initially, what the tragedy is that in Vietnam, the dogs were left behind. And so it was a huge bone of contention with the handlers who had built up this. They were literally left there as like gear, like, in the same way that when you kind of will evacuate a combat zone, you often will just incredibly leave a lot of gear behind. Well, that is what was done with the dogs at that point. And then, over the course of 20 or 30 years, by the time that Afghanistan conflict rolled around, those attitudes had changed and accommodations were made such that, like, if a canine was being decommissioned from active service, that the handler of that animal had the first right of refusal to adopt it. And in the film, one of the handlers that unfortunately got hit with an IED in the film and survived, around that same time, his dog was decommissioned and they were allowed to basically spend the rest of that dog's life together.
Good. Okay.
Yeah.
Here's some filmmaking 101 questions. What's the difference between a director and a producer?
Oh my God. Well, I suppose it depends on the context. In documentary filmmaking, a director is responsible for maintaining continuity of vision across the full scope of the production, and every decision that you make kind of radiates from this kind of white hot epicenter of core values of that particular project. And those reverberations echo out through what decisions that you make in motifs and graphics and motifs and scores, in how you're going to, the context in which you're going to set interviews. And so it all feels like the project has a cohesive identity. On a TV show, often if it's a series, an executive producer or a showrunner by title is the person who has a lot of those same responsibilities. So it's confusing, but like, I'm doing a doc series right now and I'm the showrunner on that doc series, but the responsibilities that I shoulder are the same ones as the director in a feature doc context.
Gotcha. And is one better than the other? Like, is producer credit better than executive producer, better than director? Like, is there a hierarchy in the industry of which one carries more weight, or does it matter?
Executive producer, it does matter. I mean, there is a hierarchy for sure. It's odd though, because if a project was nominated for an Oscar, the producer credit gets the Oscar in a documentary, even though oftentimes an executive producer is often seen as higher on the food chain. It's a very amorphous, and there's no real fixed answer to that, other than usually the EP is seen as being more instrumental and having a more global purview for the entire production.
Gotcha. If a prep school kid or college kid wants to get into this industry, whether it's TV, movies, documentaries, production, where do you suggest they start?
Well, I only can speak from my own experience, and which is do as deep a dive as you can on your own, figuring out what it is that you like, and the more you dig, the more you figure out whether this is a lifetime commitment, that you're in love with it enough to sustain the hardships, because it is not easy, and there's no fixed path to get where you want to go. But I would encourage people to kind of get in the mix. I don't think necessarily film school is the answer. Like, going to graduate school is a big expense with no guaranteed return on investment. Getting out into it is probably, you're better served, spending the years that you have in your youth with minimal financial obligations, dedicated to kind of getting into the mix and getting out on this, on the cruise. I would say early on, it is definitely harder to do if you're not in New York or LA. early on. Getting into the mix is, because the mix is there. The networking opportunities are there. It's not to say that you can't do it. It's just what do you want to call it? The sample size of people in the mix in a different community is going to be smaller, and there's going to be less bites at the apple to get a foot in the door. So doesn't mean you have to be there forever. I'm now around the corner from you in Colorado, and I've made the transition to be where I want to be, but it definitely was helpful early on to be there.
I mean, yeah. And would you suggest like being a production assistant as a good like foot in the door for someone that does live in an area like that?
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's you're doing the jobs that no one wants to do, but if you do them, but at the end of the day, that role is as indispensable as any role on production. If someone's not doing that job right, the entire production is aware of it. And if you're doing the job in a way that is exemplary, everyone on the production knows about it, and they're going to remember you, for good or for ill. And you can definitely distinguish yourself by doing things that might seem mundane, and you'll have a window into the process, this kind of privileged kind of perch to kind of, see how people who are experienced get it done.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a name drop here, but I was, Josie, my wife was directing Kevin Spacey on the set of House of Cards one day when they were at its peak. And she's like, do you want to be the PA for this? And I go, if I can meet Kevin Spacey, sure. This is pre-Kevin Spacey. And
yeah,
my job was hucking equipment and getting the Wawa sandwiches for everybody and hucking it back. When I wasn't working, I was roaming around the Oval Office and everywhere on this giant set for House of Cards. And then bam, got a photo with Kevin Spacey at the end of the day. And it was neat because I'd never seen behind the scenes of like a Hollywood set before, and how it looks completely different than what you see on TV. And it's House of Cards almost. So it's fun. It's fun as well,
Yeah. And you're in, it is a privileged, even at the lowest, level on the, on the ladder, it's still a privileged position. You're on the inside. And believe me, there are legions of people around the world who would give up a lot to have that same opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. John, what's your favorite documentary of all time? Okay, one of your top five. I know that's a song.
No, I mean, Gimme Shelter is my favorite documentary.
Sure, Stones.
Gimme Shelter. Like if I had to pick, it always comes to mind the moment someone. I mean, it doesn't mean that that's the thing I always want to watch, any more than my favorite song's not necessarily the song that I always want to listen to, and maybe it's not necessarily even just. I mean, saying my favorite it seems like limiting, but it is definitely the film that lit the fuse. For sure. For me.
How about regular movie? What are some of your tops?
That depends. I mean, I like anything by Kubrick. I tend to like Barry Lyndon is the kind of the odd choice of the Kubrick films, but to me, it's the kind of sleeper pick and the one that rewards you for your commitment when you watch it. It seems long, but it's kind of got this elliptical structure that kind of comes back to where it started in a way that's very rewarding. Similarly, Clockwork Orange does the same thing. It kind of comes back in a roundabout way, and you're like, oh shit, we're back here again. How did this happen? And that's kind of feels like a master at work, because you should see that coming, but you don't, So I appreciate that.
Love it. Well, wrapping up here, is there anything we didn't talk about today that you want to mention about being a filmmaker, getting into it, documentaries, anything like that?
I mean, there's so much to say. I mean, there's other sports projects I've done. It depends on, whether or not those are the things you want to talk about, but it's kind of like making documentaries in the sports space, because there's a built-in narrative structure already, given the drama. There's a dramatic arc to any sporting event. And so that framework is always handy and there for you in a way that it's like there's a chassis there that you can rely on, that in a different context you kind of have to discover, okay, well, what's the narrative arc here? But when you've always got this kind of parallel track of whatever the event was in sports that has a beginning, middle, and end, it has stakes to it, it's got peak performance in it, it makes it fun because you just know that you've got this, the juice is there already. It's just kind of up to you to, kind of push hard enough to get it done.
Yeah, I mean, every sporting event, John, even kids soccer, if you know like the context of like, well, this team is doing this and that player is looking to do this and there's a rivalry here and that coach is getting ready to get fired, more context, and the Olympics does this great, taking a sport you know nothing about, giving you the backstory on a few different of the athletes, and now you're suddenly invested. So you're right. I mean, the sports landscape, there are potential projects all over the place.
Well, I'm doing this thing right now that is about this thing that is arguably about, well, there's a bias against it because it's called esports, which is competitive video game playing. And I'm definitely a proxy for the audience that couldn't give a shit about that world. I don't play video games. I come at the world from a bias that's probably generational. Like on a generational divide, there's people who, maybe 80% of people who are over 35 and 80 feel like this isn't a real thing, competitive video game playing. And 80% of people under 35 are probably, because they're digital natives, are poised to maybe receive that idea with, a more accepting point of view. But I came into it kind of as a proxy for that audience, that side of the audience that wasn't necessarily a believer, and came to realize that, this is like arguably the most marginalized community in sports, and that they've been othered. This thing that they dedicated their life to getting great at has been devalued and dismissed by traditional sports media. And so this community of people, and also there's this sense like, oh, well, how am I supposed to follow this? I don't even know the rules of the game. But to your point, you don't know the rules of curling either when you watch the Olympics, right? And so we're doing this project about this thing that is kind of like the Olympics of esports or video games, where all of the different disciplines are consolidated into one mega event, whether it's Fortnite or Counter-Strike or EAFC, which is like the Madden of soccer, are all happening at this Olympic-style event in Saudi Arabia called the Esports World Cup. And getting people to find rooting interest in this world that they know nothing about, in these games that they don't know the X's and O's about, is about leaning on the same tried and true techniques that people use at the Olympics to kind of build rooting interest by caring about the people who are competing in them and the human interest stories behind the stakes that they have. And when you start to realize that there's this Ukrainian team who's fighting for more than bragging rights, and that they could win $2 million, and they do, and they're going to give all that money to the cause, you start to see these parallels with traditional sports like the Olympics, where there are real stakes that are happening against a surprising backdrop. And you can kind of jujitsu people's bias against this world of esports, for lack of a better word, to your advantage. When they come into it with these biases, and when you flip the script on those assumptions, it actually works to your benefit. So, those are, they're, in some respects, there's nothing new under the sun. It's just kind of like where and how you apply them.
Oh, you hear that? The old woodpecker, evergreen woodpecker. Good timing. Well, John, thanks so much for sharing all this. You're not the normal guest on here, but I wanted to get your perspective since, 30 for 30s are just a must watch, no matter what the sport is or what the story. And you share some great insight on that, on production, and appreciate you coming on today. And we will link to your website, your IMDb page down below. So if people want to check out anything you've done, I highly recommend the Marinovich Project, one of the best 30 for 30s out there. It's really prevalent to families and parents pushing their kids and what can potentially come of that. But yeah, thanks so much for coming on the podcast today. We really appreciate it.
Hey, Corey, I appreciate it, dude. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, y'all, for tuning in. We'll talk to you next time.